It was the fall of 1941 when a new shadow crossed the skies over the English Channel. British pilots of the Royal Air Force spotted a stubby little fighter with a round nose and German markings. At first, many thought it had to be something familiar, a Curtiss P-36 Mohawk, one of those outdated American planes the Germans had captured in France. But within minutes of combat, they realized this was no Mohawk. It was something entirely new and far deadlier. The aircraft was the Focke-Wulf FW 190, and it stunned the RAF. Britain's frontline fighter at the time, the Spitfire Mk V, suddenly found itself outclassed. The new German machine could outclimb, outroll, and out-accelerate it at low and medium altitudes, the very arena where most dogfights took place. For the first time since the Battle of Britain, Spitfire squadrons were on their heels. Then came the incident that gave the RAF its first real break. In June of 1942, German pilot Armin Faber became disoriented after a dogfight and mistook a Welsh airfield for his own. He landed his FW 190 in perfect condition, right into British hands. That captured fighter was flown, tested, and dissected. The verdict was sobering. The FW 190 was the finest piston engine fighter yet encountered. The only answer was to build something better, and quickly. Thus began the race to field the Spitfire Mk IX. By 1938, Germany's air war planners were already looking beyond the Messerschmitt Bf 109. The 109 was fast, sleek, and lethal, but the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, wanted insurance. They called for a second frontline fighter, something that could step in if the 109 was ever outclassed. That assignment fell to Focke-Wulf, and to the man who would become its guiding hand, Kurt Tank. A tall, confident engineer and former cavalry officer, Tank approached the problem with a very different mindset from his rivals at Messerschmitt. He looked at the Bf 109 and the British Spitfire and saw what he later called racehorses. Both machines were built for pure speed and agility. In a smooth course, with perfect maintenance, they could outrun almost anything. But in Tank's eyes, they were fragile. Too fragile for the brutal conditions of war. His vision was for a tougher breed. Not a racehorse, but a cavalry horse. Rugged, resilient, and dependable when the going got rough. That meant priorities had to shift. The new fighter had to be easy to maintain, even on muddy, improvised frontline strips. It had to be stable enough for pilots with only a few hours of training to handle in combat. And it had to take punishment, absorbing battle damage yet still bringing its pilot home. To achieve this, Tank made one bold choice right away. Instead of an inline Daimler-Benz like the 109, he selected a BMW 801 radial engine. It was heavier and less aerodynamic, but it was tough. It simplified cooling and, most importantly, it reduced Germany's dependence on Daimler-Benz, whose engines were already stretched thin. The result was the birth of a new philosophy in German fighter design. At the heart of the FW 190 was its BMW 801 radial engine, a big, air-cooled powerhouse that delivered between 1,600 and 1,800 horsepower, depending on the variant. It wasn't as sleek as the liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz used in the 109, but it was far more forgiving in combat. The radial could take hits, keep running, and didn't depend on fragile coolant lines, an enormous advantage when bullets started flying. To make the engine manageable, German engineers introduced something remarkable, the Kommandogerat. This mechanical computer automatically coordinated throttle, supercharger, fuel mixture, and propeller pitch. Instead of juggling half a dozen levers, the pilot only needed to move a single control. In the chaos of battle, that simplicity could mean the difference between life and death. The airframe itself carried Tank's philosophy of toughness. The landing gear was set wide apart, folding out from the wings instead of retracting inward like the 109's narrow gear. That meant fewer accidents on takeoff and landing, a problem that plagued Messerschmitt pilots throughout the war. Visibility was another strength. The cockpit sat high, giving the pilot a commanding view. Later models even introduced a bubble-style canopy, nearly unobstructed, allowing better awareness in a dogfight. Of course, no design was perfect. The FW-190's relatively small wing area made it faster to roll, but also raised its stall speed, demanding careful handling at low speeds. And while the BMW 801 gave it superb power at low and medium altitudes, its performance dropped sharply above 20,000 feet, leaving it at a disadvantage against high-altitude opponents. Still, in the combat zones where most fights occurred, these trade-offs made the FW-190 a fearsome and well-balanced machine. From the start, the FW-190 was designed as a platform that could be stretched, modified, and adapted. That's why its story isn't just one airplane, but an entire family. The backbone was the A series, known as Anton. From the early A1s of 1941 to the later A9s, these were the fighters most feared over the Channel and the Russian front. Each step brought refinements, more armor, heavier armament, stronger engines. Field kits called Rüstsatz or Umbau allowed units to bolt on extra weapons or equipment as needed. When the Luftwaffe needed a fighter bomber, the Focke-Wulf was ready. The FW-190 F and G series were dedicated ground attack machines. The F-8 in particular became the workhorse of close air support, lugging bombs and rockets into the thick of battle. Allied tank crews and infantry came to know the howl of the 190's radial as a sign of incoming trouble. Against the big American bomber streams, the Germans armed the 190 with some of the heaviest weapons ever carried by a single-engine fighter. Standard 20mm Mk 151 cannons were often joined by 30mm Mk 108s, capable of shredding a B-17 or B-24 with just a few hits. For long-range disruption, the ungainly 210mm WGR-21 rockets were mounted under the wings, fired into the dense bomber formations to scatter them. Later, the sleeker R-4M rockets, later famous on the Me-262 jet, were also tested on the 190. As the war dragged on, new variants appeared. The long-nosed FW-190D Dora, with its Junkers Jumo 213 engine, entered service in 1944 as a high-altitude interceptor. And at the extreme end came the Ta 152, Kurt Tank's final masterpiece, stretched with longer wings, powered by the Daimler-Benz 603, and capable of speeds up to 470 miles per hour. In every role, fighter, bomber hunter, or ground attacker, the FW-190 proved it could adapt to the demands of total war. When the FW-190 first appeared, its immediate benchmark was the Spitfire Mk V. In nearly every category, speed, acceleration, roll rate, climb at low altitudes, the German fighter came out ahead. The only area where the Spitfire still held an edge was in a tight turning circle. That single advantage wasn't enough. RAF losses mounted until the urgent arrival of the Spitfire Mk IX, fitted with the two-stage supercharged Merlin 61. Only then did the balance return to something resembling even ground. American fighters brought their own challenges. Against the big, rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, the match often depended on altitude. Above 20,000 feet, the P-47's turbo-supercharged radial gave it the advantage. But lower down, the FW-190's quicker roll and tighter handling could give Thunderbolt pilots a nasty surprise. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed the game entirely. With its long range, excellent high-altitude performance, and superb agility, the Mustang became the perfect escort. By late 1943 and 1944, swarms of P-51s accompanied American bomber formations deep into Germany, erasing much of the Luftwaffe's room to maneuver. Still, in the right conditions, the FW-190 remained a formidable opponent. Its blistering roll rate allowed it to change direction faster than almost anything in the sky. Its climb rate at low altitude gave it punch in surprise attacks, and its heavy armament meant that any hit could be devastating. But the trade-offs were real. A relatively high stall speed demanded caution, and at high altitude the BMW 801 simply couldn't keep pace. Against ever-denser American escort formations, even the FW-190's strengths were often not enough. The Western Front was where the FW-190 first carved its reputation. In 1941 and 1942, it dominated the skies over the English Channel, outclassing the Spitfire Mk V and giving Luftwaffe pilots a vital edge in cross-channel clashes. By 1943 and 1944, however, its mission profile shifted. Instead of dueling with RAF fighters, the FW-190 became a workhorse in the desperate defense against daylight raids by American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. Armed with heavy cannons and sometimes ungainly rocket tubes, squadrons of FW-19s were thrown head-on into bomber streams in an attempt to break them apart. On the Eastern Front, the aircraft proved equally valuable, though in different ways. Soviet fields were often little more than muddy strips or frozen ground. The FW-190's wide, sturdy landing gear handled those conditions far better than the narrow-tracked Bf-109. Its rugged BMW radial engine could soak up punishment, and many pilots told stories of limping back home with wings shredded or cylinders blown. Against the Red Air Force, it was feared not only as a dogfighter but as a potent ground attack machine, strafing supply lines and hammering tanks. Even in North Africa and the Mediterranean, the FW-190 showed its versatility. Special filters were fitted to protect engines from desert sand. Units flew escort missions for Axis bombers and also dove against Allied convoys or troops in close support roles. Though relatively few in number compared to Europe, these desert-configured FW-190s proved the design could adapt to almost any theater the Luftwaffe faced. The story of the FW-190 wasn't just written in the skies. It was also written in the factories. By war's end, roughly 23,800 aircraft of all variants had been built, making it one of the most numerous fighters in the Luftwaffe's inventory. To shield production from Allied bombing, German planners spread assembly across dozens of smaller workshops and subcontractors. Wings, fuselages, and engines were built in different locations, then brought together for final assembly. This dispersal kept output going even under relentless American and British air raids. One of the fighter's greatest industrial strengths was its modular design. Units in the field could adapt the airplane without waiting for factory refits. Mechanics could bolt on extra armor, swap out cannons, or hang drop tanks for longer missions. That flexibility made the FW-190 a true jack-of-all-trades, able to shift roles as quickly as the front lines demanded. But by 1944, the biggest problem wasn't production. It was fuel. With the Reich's oil supplies collapsing under bombing and the loss of Romanian fields, fuel shortages became crippling. New pilots arrived at squadrons with barely a handful of training hours, and even veterans often sat grounded for lack of gasoline. By 1945, airfields held rows of brand-new FW-19s that never left the ground. Silent reminders that even the finest machine is useless without the fuel to fly. When the war ended, the story of the FW-190 didn't simply stop. A number of captured examples were pressed into service by the victors. France flew refurbished machines under the designation NC-900, while the Soviets used several as advanced trainers. In Britain, the United States, and the USSR, captured FW-19s were flown hard in testing programs. Their strengths and weaknesses studied closely to help shape the next generation of fighters. Today, the Butcher Bird survives both as artifact and as legend. Restored examples can be seen in museums across the world. the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and the Musée de l'Air in Paris all preserve original machines. A handful of rare survivors, including long-nosed Dora models and even a Ta 152, remain standing proof of German engineering skill at the end of the piston era. In Germany, Focke-Wulf GmbH continues to build faithful replicas of the FW 190A-8/N, allowing modern pilots to experience the aircraft's ferocious handling at air shows. The legacy is clear. The FW 190 was not just another fighter. It was one of the most versatile, rugged, and feared piston-engine combat aircraft of World War II. If you've ever seen one of these Warbirds in person, or even heard its BMW radial roar, share your memories in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Together we'll keep the stories of these legendary machines alive.